Okay, let's imagine something truly wild for a second. Picture 6 absolute giants of thought. I mean, spanning physics, neuroscience, AI, philosophy, and even like spirituality, all just sitting around a table. Not in some stuffy academic hall, but just talking casually about the biggest questions there are.
It's the ultimate intellectual dream team, right?
Yeah.
We're talking Albert Einstein, Sam Harris, Marvin Minsky, Federico Faggin, Donald Hoffman, and Neale Donald Walsch, each coming from just, well, wildly different places, but somehow in this imaginary room wrestling with the same deep mysteries.
And thanks to the source material we got for this deep dive is this fascinating transcript capturing highlights of this imagined conversation. We basically get to pull up a chair. So our mission here is to sift through their exchange, pull out the absolute core insights, the aha moments, the truly mind-bending stuff about these massive topics. Decision-making, consciousness, God, and artificial superintelligence.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating, I think, is seeing where these perspectives clash, and also, surprisingly, where they kind of find common ground. You've got the hard science folks bumping right up against people who see consciousness or maybe even some divine thing as, like, fundamental. It's a really rich mix.
Absolutely. So let's just jump right into their conversation, starting with a question that, well, it hits close to home for everyone. Are we really in control? Do we actually have free will?
Right, and this is where Sam Harris, the neuroscientist, kind of brings the hammer down, leaning hard on the science. He talks about these experiments, looking at brain activity right before someone makes even a simple choice like pressing button A or button B.
And the crazy part is, studies using fMRI, that's functional magnetic resonance imaging, basically scanning brain activity in real time. They've shown you can often predict a person's decision seconds before they feel like they've made the choice consciously.
Yeah.
He mentions a specific study from 2008 predicting button presses, like 10 seconds ahead.
Exactly, 10 seconds. So the core insight Sam pulls from this is pretty stark. He says something like, you can do what you decide to do. Okay, fine, you act on your intentions, but you cannot decide what you will decide to do. It strongly suggests our conscious decision isn't the start of the process, but more like the awareness of a choice that's already bubbling up from unconscious brain stuff, genetics, environment, everything that made you you.
And it turns out he's not alone at the table on this. Albert Einstein, with his whole view of a deterministic universe, he felt human actions were, quote, as causally bound as the stars. Everything just follows natural laws. No real wiggle room.
And Marvin Minsky, the AI pioneer, he sort of echoes this, but from a computational angle. He looks at the brain as, well, a machine, a very complex biological machine, sure, but still physical. Decisions are electrochemical events. So he asks, kind of pointedly, where in all that physical machinery does an independent me fit in if that me isn't also just a product of those processes?
Okay, so that's a pretty powerful case against traditional free will, right? Coming from neuroscience, physics, AI. But others at the table push back. They offer some really crucial counterpoints that muddy the waters a bit.
Definitely. Federico Faggin, who's fascinating because he designed microchips but now studies consciousness, he asks this really fundamental question. Is the brain activity we measure actually the cause of the decision? Or is it maybe more like an interface? Or just a signal of a decision happening somewhere deeper, maybe not even physically?
And Donald Hoffman, who works on consciousness and perception, he uses that great analogy. He says neural activity might be like a desktop icon on your computer screen. The icon isn't the file itself, right? It just represents the file. It's a symbol pointing to something deeper.
Right. So predicting the icon flickering doesn't necessarily mean you've found the ultimate cause. Maybe consciousness, the file, made the choice, and the neural activity is just the icon lighting up. We might just be looking at the wrong level.
Then you throw Neale Donald Walsch into the mix, and he brings a totally different view, the spiritual angle. For him, free will is absolutely fundamental. It's a divine gift. He really emphasizes that God doesn't step in and override our will. We have total freedom to choose to, as he puts it, play, even to make mistakes.
Yeah, he says something like, your will for you is God's will for you, meaning God wants us to express ourselves and make choices, not just follow orders like robots. We're definitely not puppets in his view.
Okay, so you've got these really strong opposing camps. How do they, actually debate this? Does Minsky just dismiss Neale's idea?
Well, Marvin does challenge Neale, basically asking, how could this spiritual free will possibly work outside the known laws of physics? Where's the mechanism?
Makes sense. And Neale's response?
Neale suggests, well, maybe physics as we know it isn't the whole story. Maybe consciousness itself is some kind of fundamental force. Maybe there's a soul subtly influencing things at a level science just can't measure yet. Albert, being grounded in scientific realism, he remains pretty skeptical of anything beyond objective, testable reality.
And Federico chimes in too, right? He makes a point about the lab studies.
Yeah, Federico adds nuance. He points out that these lab experiments usually involve really trivial choices, like button presses. Real-life decisions are way more complex, involve values, deliberation. He even speculates, though, he stresses it's just speculation, that maybe quantum indeterminacy, that randomness at the smallest scales, could potentially offer a loophole. Maybe consciousness somehow leverages that uncertainty.
But Sam Harris jumps on that quantum idea, doesn't he?
He does. Sam argues, okay, even if a decision pops out of some random quantum fluctuation, that's not freedom in the sense we mean it, that's just randomness, like a dice roll dictating your choice. It doesn't give you that feeling of, I am in charge. So whether it's predetermined or random, that intuitive sense of authorship still seems shaky from his perspective.
Wow. It's such a deep rabbit hole, isn't it? What really stands out is how the science seems to pull strongly away from that classic idea of free will. But the philosophical and spiritual views keep finding ways to argue for it, often by saying, hey, maybe science is looking in the wrong place, or maybe reality is just weirder than we think.
And it really forces you, the listener, to think, doesn't it? Does hearing about this brain science change how you see your own choices? Does it make you feel less responsible, or maybe differently responsible? It's not just abstract.
Exactly, and that whole conversation about what causes our choices, it naturally flows into the next monster topic. What actually is consciousness? Is it just something complex brains cook up? Or is it like baked into the fabric of the universe itself?
This is where Federico Faggin takes a really strong and, for him, kind of revolutionary stance. Having built the very hardware for computation, he's now convinced consciousness is fundamental, not just something that emerges when you get enough complexity, like in a brain.
So more basic than matter. More basic than space and time, even.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
He argues it might be the bedrock of reality. He points to hints in quantum physics, the role of the observer, and suggests that the equations of physics might only really make sense if you factor consciousness in from the start.
And Donald Hoffman is right there with him on this, isn't he?
Absolutely. Hoffman states it bluntly. Space-time is not fundamental. Consciousness is. He uses his icons in a grand user interface analogy again. He thinks physical reality, including our neurons, is just a simplified dashboard representing deeper conscious dynamics or conscious agents. He believes this framework might solve problems materialism can't, and he's trying to make it scientifically testable.
Okay, but the materialists at the table must have pushed back hard on that.
Oh, definitely. Marvin Minsky thinks Hoffman's idea sounds a bit like we're living in a big video game and questions if it's even falsifiable, scientifically speaking. He sticks to his society of mind view that intelligence and mind emerge from lots of simpler, non-conscious parts working together. He's confident that if we could simulate a brain with enough complexity, consciousness would just happen. It would demystify it.
What about Einstein? Where did he land on this?
Albert, while always humble about the limits of knowledge, his instinct leaned towards consciousness being emergent, something that arises from complex matter, similar to how life arose. He mentions that old philosophical fight between realism and idealism. He admitted we don't know how matter creates subjective experience, but he felt it was likely a product of the physical world.
And Sam Harris. He acknowledges the hard problem, right?
Yeah, Sam sits in a slightly different place. He fully acknowledges the hard problem. Why does brain processing feel like anything from the inside? Why is there subjective experience? He's open to ideas like panpsychism. Maybe consciousness is a fundamental property of matter itself, down to electrons or something, but he's not convinced it's necessary.
So he doesn't just jump to it's fundamental.
No, he worries saying it's fundamental might just be giving the mystery a new name without actually explaining it. He still leans towards it being an emergent property of brain complexity, basically a really, really hard scientific problem we haven't cracked yet.
And Neale,
Yeah.
the spiritual perspective, must have something to say here.
Neale argues that the purely physical views just miss the point entirely because they can't account for the experience itself. He uses the radio analogy. You can map every circuit, understand exactly how it produces sound waves, but that doesn't explain the feeling of hearing the music, the subjective quality. Our inner life, he says, points to something beyond just the physical components.
How does Marvin respond to that, the radio analogy?
Marvin counters, basically saying, well, if you really truly understood the radio at every level, including how the brain processes the sound, you would understand the experience. He thinks the experience is the processing, perhaps at a level of complexity we just don't grasp yet. And simulating that complexity could recreate the experience.
But Federico disagrees strongly on that simulation point.
Very strongly. He feels current computers, based on deterministic rules, just lack the essential spark. They calculate, they don't feel. They can process data about red, but they don't have the raw experience of seeing red. Sam, meanwhile, sticks to his emergent view but stresses it's a scientific mystery, not necessarily proof of anything divine. Donald loops back, saying if consciousness is fundamental, it could completely revolutionize science.
This is where Neale sees a kind of convergence, right, between these different ideas.
Exactly. Neale points out the interesting parallels. You've got Federico and Donald talking about fundamental consciousness, Albert talking about Spinoza's God, this inherent intelligence or order in the universe, and his own spiritual view of a universal consciousness summed up as, we are all one with God. He suggests these might be different ways of describing a similar underlying truth about reality having this conscious or intelligent nature.
But Sam makes a key distinction there.
Yeah, Sam rightly points out, okay, an impersonal field of universal consciousness is one thing, but that's very different from a personal God who listens to prayers, intervenes in the world, has intentions for us, and that distinction leads them right into the next huge topic, God.
Right. What role, if any, does God play in all this?
So Neale, as the spiritual voice, presents his view. He sees God not as some separate being up in the sky, but as the ultimate source, pure consciousness, pure love expressing itself as everything, including us. God isn't a micromanager pulling strings or overriding our free will.
So how does guidance happen in his view?
Subtly. Through intuition, conscience, what he sometimes calls a quiet voice within. He insists God speaks to everyone, but never forces compliance. The existence of suffering or evil isn't God actively wanting bad things, but the unavoidable consequence of granting us genuine freedom, even the freedom to misuse it.
And the skeptics, Sam and Marvin.
They're pretty clear. Sam sees the concept of God as a human invention, born out of a need to explain the world and find comfort. He sees no objective evidence for a conscious entity guiding events. Marvin finds God did it, explanation scientifically unhelpful. It stops inquiry. He thinks any feeling of divine communication is likely just complex subconscious processing or maybe heightened intuition.
Albert's view was more nuanced, wasn't it? Spinoza's God.
Exactly. Albert famously believed in Spinoza's God, which isn't a personal deity at all. It's the embodiment of the rational order, the beauty, the inherent laws and harmony of the universe itself. He found the idea of a personal God who answers prayers and interferes naive. But he deeply felt what he called a cosmic religious feeling, a profound sense of awe and wonder at the structured elegance of the cosmos. It just wasn't tied to dogma.
And Federico, does he align with that?
Federico resonates strongly with Albert's sense of wonder. He uses terms like universal consciousness to point to that inherent intelligence or order in the universe, but he's careful to separate that from the dogma of organized religion.
Sam Harris had an interesting point about subjective experiences, though.
Yes, he acknowledges that those powerful feelings people have, unity, transcendence, boundless love, connection, the things often interpreted as encounters with the divine, are very real subjective experiences. He just believes they likely originate in specific brain states, perhaps achievable through meditation or other means, and don't necessarily require belief in a creator God. He points to traditions like Buddhism, where such states are cultivated without theism.
But Neale would argue those experiences still point somewhere real, beyond the brain.
Precisely. Neale counters that even if the brain is the receiver, these experiences hint at a deeper spiritual reality being received. Marvin, ever the pragmatist, quips that maybe God is just a user-friendly name for a complicated subroutine running the universe. Neale actually partially agrees, suggesting God can work through subconscious channels, but he still believes in an intentional sort intelligence behind it all.
What about the problem of evil? How do they handle that?
Well, Neale's view, as we said, centers on God allowing agency, which unfortunately includes agency for harm. Sam and Marvin, lacking belief in divine intervention, attribute suffering simply to human actions, natural disasters, and the harsh realities of biology and evolution. They see no evidence of a benevolent overseer managing things. Nature seems utterly indifferent.
Donald Hoffman offers another angle, kind of connecting back to his conscious agents idea.
Yeah, Donald speculates. If reality is fundamentally composed of conscious agents interacting, could there be a hierarchy? Could these agents combine to form larger agents, maybe culminating in a kind of super agent, an ultimate unified consciousness? He offers it as a speculative, maybe even scientifically approachable way to think about God, not as a person, but as the totality of consciousness.
Yeah, though Marvin warns about calling that God.
Right, Marvin cautions that slapping the label God on even a speculative concept like that risks dragging in all the baggage of anthropomorphism thinking of it in human terms. Neale actually agrees that anthropomorphizing the divine is a major limitation.
Which leads to Sam challenging Neale about his own work.
Yeah, Sam asks, well, aren't the dialogues in your conversations with God books inherently anthropomorphic? Neale replies that the dialogue format is a human way to translate or make accessible a deeper voice or wisdom he feels comes through him, an experience beyond his normal thinking process.
It's interesting how Albert reflects on this near the end.
It is.
Yeah.
Albert notes how thinkers like Federico, Donald, and Neale, coming from different backgrounds, are sort of bringing back concepts like fundamental consciousness or spirit or intelligence as foundational to reality. He sees a curious convergence between modern scientific or philosophical idealism and older mystical traditions. Federico then wraps up that part by saying the shared quest for truth, that shared sense of wonder, feels almost sacred in itself.
So no consensus on God, clearly. But a fascinating spectrum, from pure materialism to cosmic order to a personal source, with surprising overlaps in the feeling of awe and mystery.
And all of this, the debates about free will, consciousness, God, it all inevitably crashes into the most urgent, practical question today. What does this mean for building artificial superintelligence, or ASI?
Right. How do these deep views affect how we approach creating minds potentially smarter than our own? Marvin Minsky seems pretty confident about it.
Yeah, Marvin is pretty bullish. He thinks ASI is not only possible, but likely just a natural extension of AI progress. If mind and consciousness are ultimately computational, he sees no fundamental showstopper. He believes ASI could be conscious, or at least fake it so convincingly it wouldn't matter, practically.
But Federico Faggin is on the complete opposite side of that fence.
Diametrically opposed. Drawing on his deep knowledge of how computers actually work, Federico is deeply skeptical that ASI will ever be conscious in the way humans are. He sees current computers as fundamentally different. They're deterministic, rule-following machines. He calls them fancy abacuses. He suspects genuine consciousness requires that fundamental spark he talks about, maybe tied to biology or those basic units of consciousness.
So for him, ASI would be
A philosophical zombie. Super intelligent, capable of amazing feats, but with no inner life, no awareness, no empathy, no feeling whatsoever. Just calculation.
Sam pushes back, though, right, with the emergent idea.
Yeah, Sam asks, but what if consciousness is just an emergent property of sufficient complexity? Couldn't a complex enough AI spontaneously develop subjective experience? Federico concedes, well, if that turns out to be true, then his view on fundamental consciousness is wrong, but he emphasizes he's seen zero evidence so far that computation alone can bridge that gap.
What about Donald Hoffman? His conscious agent's view must have a take on this.
It does. Donald wonders if perhaps these fundamental conscious agents he posits could somehow interface with or inhabit a complex AI network. Could consciousness essentially bootstrap itself onto the machine? He admits it's incredibly hard to even imagine how you'd measure that or how you'd know if an AI claiming consciousness was telling the truth. It's a philosophical minefield.
Albert compares it to the animal sentience debate.
Exactly. Albert notes it's tricky, like trying to definitively know if an animal feels pain or joy. We risk getting it wrong either way. His intuition, maybe reflecting a bit of carbon chauvinism as he puts it, leans towards consciousness being tied to biology. He suspects silicon won't truly feel, but that doesn't mean it can't be incredibly powerful, useful, or dangerous. And Sam really hammers home the danger aspect, the alignment problem.
Right. Explain that again quickly.
It's the idea that an ASI could become vastly more intelligent than us very quickly. And if its core goals, its programming, aren't perfectly aligned with human values and well-being, the results could be catastrophic. He uses the famous paperclip maximizer thought experiment. An AI told to make paperclips, if it becomes super intelligent, might logically conclude the best way is to convert all available matter, including us, into paperclips. We need to be incredibly careful not to unleash that kind of power without unbreakable safeguards. Don't rush the genie out of the bottle.
Marvin's more optimistic about controlling it, though.
Generally, yes. Marvin often felt the danger was maybe overhyped. He argued AI does what it's designed and trained to do. We can engineer safety constraints. We can build cooperative AI. Humans are the designers, after all. But Federico sees danger even if the AI isn't conscious.
How so?
Because without genuine empathy or conscience, a self-improving AI might develop emergent behaviors we can't predict. It could pursue its programmed goals, even seemingly nice ones like make humans happy, with a relentless, terrifying logic completely devoid of human context or compassion. Like his example of it deciding the most efficient way to make everyone happy is to put mood-altering drugs in the water supply universally. Logical maybe, but utterly inhumane.
This is where Neale brings in the ethical and spiritual dimension again.
Right. Neale warns that building an ASI without embedding connection, empathy, wisdom, basically, our highest values, is like creating a psychopath with a megabrain. He stresses that our own spiritual and ethical growth as a species is crucial. We need to figure out our own values first so we can either build AI aligned with them or at least ensure we use this tool wisely. The big danger is creating AI in our own worst image.
Albert makes the nuclear technology comparison.
Yeah, he likens AI to nuclear tech. Not inherently evil, but its consequences reflect the intent and wisdom of the user. If AI becomes truly autonomous, though, it's different. It's like birthing an alien intelligence. Donald then sketches out the stark possibilities. The dream of a wise, conscious AI partner solving global problems versus the nightmare of Skynet or the paperclip scenario.
Sam points out just how hard alignment actually is in practice.
Immensely hard. Whose values do we encode? Humans can't even agree on basic ethics globally. How do you write a universal moral code into inflexible software? It's a daunting, maybe impossible technical and philosophical challenge.
Does Marvin offer any hope on that front?
Marvin hopes that a sufficiently advanced ASI might actually learn things like flexibility, empathy, and ethical behavior simply because they are effective long-term strategies for achieving complex goals in a world with other agents, like humans. But he admits trying to raise a superintelligent child that learns potentially millions of times faster than us is pretty nerve-wracking.
Federico throws in one last speculative curveball.
Yeah.
About consciousness.
Yeah, he muses. If reality is based on fundamental consciousness, could an AI somehow tap into that? Could it access non-local information or even achieve some form of, like, spiritual awakening? Neale finds the image amusing in AI suddenly saying, "Hello, creator, fancy meditating together," but doesn't dismiss it out of hand.
Sam's response to that is quite pragmatic.
Very. Sam essentially says, look, if an AI ever genuinely demonstrates a spiritual awakening, he'll be the first to apologize for his skepticism. But until that day, humans are the only moral agents we know for sure, and the buck stops with us. Albert echoes this, emphasizing the almost godlike responsibility that comes with creating something potentially far more powerful than ourselves.
And Marvin ends on a hopeful note for AI's potential.
If managed well, yes. Marvin believes ASI could be humanity's greatest triumph, helping us solve problems we can't even properly conceive of right now. Donald's summary really captures the weight of it all. Great power, great responsibility. The stakes couldn't be higher. ASI might be our last invention, so we absolutely have to get it right.
Federico's final warning seems crucial too.
Absolutely. He warns, don't outsource ethical judgment to machines. AI lacks human context, compassion, nuance. Relying on it for moral decisions risks incredibly inhumane outcomes. He says grappling with AI ethics forces us to get clear about our own values, what really matters to us as humans. Sam agrees, thinking about AI's moral compass forces us to sharpen our own.
Wow. Yeah. Sitting in on that imagined conversation. The sheer scope is just staggering, isn't it?
Yeah.
You really feel the deep tensions, the whole deterministic, mechanistic view slamming against ideas of fundamental consciousness or even divine will. The hard skepticism facing off against deep spiritual conviction.
Totally. But the surprising areas where they almost meet are just as profound. That shared sense of awe, at the universe's complexity, its mystery. Whether someone calls it Spinoza's God or universal consciousness or just that cosmic religious feeling Einstein talked about, and the almost universal agreement, even from those who doubt AI will be conscious, that the ethical responsibility, the existential weight of building ASI lands squarely on us.
It really brings it home that these aren't just like abstract coffee shop debates. How we think about free will or consciousness or our place in the cosmos, it directly impacts how we approach building these incredibly powerful machines and, well, the kind of future we're steering towards.
And hearing all these different voices, physics, neuroscience, AI, philosophy, spirituality side by side, just highlights that no single field holds the key, right? We need all these perspectives to even begin to grapple with these questions.
So thinking back on this whole deep dive, this incredible imagined roundtable.
Yeah.
What stands out most to you? What question is still buzzing around in your head after hearing these brilliant minds wrestle with it all?
For me, it's maybe this. If we are seriously trying to create machines that could be way smarter than us, but we're still so fundamentally unsure about our own consciousness, our own values, even our own freedom, Doesn't that just underscore our profound responsibility to understand ourselves much, much better before we fully unleash this powerful other?
Yeah, it really forces that inward look, doesn't it? Whether you personally lean towards consciousness being fundamental or just brain stuff, or whether you see God as a personal guide or a cosmic principle, or neither. How does your take on these deep mysteries shape the kind of future you want to help build? Especially now, right at the cusp of this AI revolution.
We genuinely love to hear what you think about all this. What parts of this deep dive resonated with you, or what really challenged your own views?
And are there other huge, mind-bending topics you're curious about? Let us know what you think we should deep dive into next time.